Tourism Committee. Can I remind everyone present to turn off all mobile phones and other electronic devices, with the exception of those in the media who have been given special permission to tweet during the meeting, but in that case all phones should be turned to silent. Now, we do have, for some reason, an unusually large number of guests with us this morning, so I just want to make a few procedural announcements, if I may. Firstly, we are not anticipating any test of the fire alarm this morning, so should there be a fire alarm, please follow instructions from the security staff in terms of exiting the building. Can I just remind all those in the public gallery, and you're extremely welcome, thank you for coming and joining us. If only all our committee meetings attracted such levels of public interest, I think members would appreciate that. But can I remind you all to be courteous and respectful. This is not a public meeting, so I do not expect to hear anything from the gallery, and any clapping or cheering, or indeed booing for that matter, will not be tolerated. There should be no filming or photography by any people other than authorised members of the media who have sought prior permission. Now, we're expecting the session this morning to last probably for around 90 minutes. When it comes to questions from members, I will be prioritising committee members first, because we do have some additional MSPs with us. And given we have quite a lot of ground to cover, I would ask both questioners and those answering the questions to be short and succinct in their answers. We have with us this morning, I should say we have apologies from one member of the committee, Rhoda Grant, and we have Claire Baker, who's here as a substitute. Welcome. And we have two additional MSPs, Maureen Watt and Graham Pearson. Welcome to you both. Now, we have one item on the agenda this morning, which is a continuation of our inquiry into the Scottish Government's renewable energy targets. And I would just remind members and witnesses that is what we are here to address. I would like to welcome our panel who are here before us. Just starting from the left, we have Graham Lang and Mark Gibson, who are from Communities Against Turbines. And from the Trump Organisation, we have Donald Trump Sr., Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, and George Sorial, Executive Vice President and Counsel. Welcome to you all. Thank you for coming. I wonder if the witnesses would like to start by making a brief opening statement of 2 to 3 minutes. Perhaps, Mr. Trump, would you like to start?
Thank you very much. My name is Donald Trump, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak. It is a very, very serious problem that we are addressing. In my opinion, it's one of the most serious problems that Scotland will have or has had. Wind turbines, not renewable energy. I'm all for renewable energy. I believe in wave technology. I believe in tide technology. In particular, I think you have great opportunities for other things and other forms of energy. But as an example, hydro. But wind turbines made in China are going to be the destruction and almost a total destruction of your tourism industry. If you look at what's happened recently, a very unattractive wind turbine was just put up at Royal Aberdeen right on the course. Royal Aberdeen didn't know about it. The members are going absolutely crazy. I said, and you haven't seen the worst. Wait till they turn it on and you hear all the noise. They don't know what to do. They didn't know it was going to happen. They were blindsided. The fact is that I've built I brought some magazines along. I built and what I said I was going to build, except it came out even beyond what I said, and everybody's agreeing to that. I've spent a tremendous amount of money, debt-free, no debt on the property, nothing, building what many are already considering to be the greatest golf course anywhere in the world. I don't want to see it destroyed by having 11 monstrosities built, looming over it, literally 1 mile away. It's actually land-based. It's not sea-based, because when you're talking about 1 mile, you're really talking about land-based. We don't want this to happen. Now, in the Vattenfall case, that's even worse than most of them, because this is a test center where they put up all different types of windmills. So instead of, at least if you took the best-looking one, of which there are none, and you put up 11 that were identical, this is going to be all different companies are going to be testing windmills. They don't have to do it. It's a total redundancy, because that's done all over the place. And by the way, many countries have decided They don't want wind because it doesn't work without massive subsidies. It kills massive amounts of birds and wildlife, and there are lots of other reasons. So it's a very inefficient form of energy. It's an energy that when you need it most, you don't get it because the wind isn't blowing when you need it most. And from the standpoint of Scotland, I think almost most importantly, other than the fact that the subsidies are enormous, almost most importantly, they are so unattractive, so ugly, so noisy, and so dangerous that if Scotland does this, I think Scotland will be in serious trouble. I think you'll lose your tourism industry to Ireland and lots of other places that are laughing at what Scotland's doing. And I would be pleased to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Trump. I would just remind you, Mr. Trump, and the members here, there's not an inquiry into a particular planning application for any single development. We require to address the broader issues, and I'm sure that will come out in the questioning. Communities Against Turbines, would somebody like to say something? Mr. Lang. Yes.
Good morning, convener, members. My name is Graham Lang, and I'm a committee member of Communities Against Turbines Scotland. CATS does what it says on the label. We are the national voice of all those groups campaigning against the flood of wind farm and smaller turbine projects that are damaging the landscape and the visual and residential amenity of people living near to them. We provide a service to communities. By residential amenity, I of course mean noise. My group joined CATS because it represents on a national level what my and other groups have been doing for years and takes protest to a higher level, which is why I am sitting here today. My experience as an active participant in the wind farm debate is extensive. I am chair of 2 campaign organisations and mentor others. I am a member of 2 wind farm community benefit forums. I am also trustee of the Association for the Protection of Rural Scotland, Scotland's oldest environmental charity. My interest in renewables has taken me to every all-energy exhibition and conference in Aberdeen since 2006. And over that time, most of the Renewable UK, formerly British Wind Energy Association, exhibitions and conferences. It's quite interesting this year at the All Energy Show, out of 75 hours of conference time, only 3 is devoted to onshore wind. I take an interest in planning policy and when looking at applications, examine the conflict between an applicant's subjective assessment of policy and what I consider to be a more honest and objective approach. From personal experience, I'm very, very aware of the stress communities are under from the moment they become aware of a proposal through an applicant's public exhibition, and sometimes much earlier. From then on, they live with uncertainty of when the application will be made and what the eventual outcome will be. The process takes years before there is consent of refusal, and refusal does not mean the end of it. For many poor people, lives are on hold. When I came to the parliamentary debate on the 1st December, every member's desk had a leaflet from Scottish Renewables on it. I have a copy here giving their version of the facts. They say wind works. It does about a quarter of the time. They say wind is not expensive. It is at least twice as expensive as the wholesale price of the electricity produced. They say wind cuts CO2 emissions, possibly, but not by a headline-grabbing amount, and boy, is it expensive. They say wind farms do not harm tourism or property prices. It will do, and it does. They say people support Scotland's wind energy. Many people say to me they like wind turbines, but they follow it with the caveat, but we wouldn't like to live next to one. They say wind is a major contributor to the economy. How much are we paying to subsidise each job? They say environmental impacts of onshore wind are limited and managed. That's what the developers say. The residual impacts on landscape and amenity are adverse and unacceptable. They say wind farms are not noisy. If that is the case, why are people weeping in their beds at night, unable to sleep and swallowing sleeping pills and antidepressants by the handful and reporting a huge variety of illnesses? These people are treated as collateral damage or cannon fodder. They just happen to be in the way. Tough. We get the same sound bites from other pro-wind organisations, and they just do not stand up to sensible scrutiny. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lang. Thank you both for your opening remarks. I think it's fair to say to Communities Against... Sorry, Mr. Gibson, did you want to say something briefly?
Thank you very much. I'll be brief. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity as well to appear before you. My name is Mark Gibson. By way of background, my degree is in zoology from Aberdeen University. I'm a chartered surveyor of some 30 years standing. I'm very strongly involved in our local community. I'm on the local school board. I'm a trustee of the new United Nations Biosphere. 12.5 years ago, I came to Craigengillan, a historic but sadly neglected estate in East Ayrshire. Since then, we've worked very hard to restore it and bring it back to life. Our village, and this is the important thing, our village is a former coal mining community of some 3,000 souls. And since the closure of the deep pits a generation ago, it has suffered terrible levels of unemployment and social deprivation. It was an excluded community. We have, all of us, and I do mean all of us, this is Burns country, we've worked together to build a new future, one based on nature and cultural tourism and outdoor activities. We've received great support from our local council and also from this government, notably in connection with the greatest current project, the creation of the Scottish Dark Sky Observatory, which promises to be a wonderful asset, not just for the coal mining areas of the Doon Valley, but for the whole of Scotland. We support the work of CATS, and I'm here to illustrate by giving a first-hand account of the sustained and almost intolerable pressure from wind farm developers on our community over the last 8 years. It's a case of a hard-hit but united community coming together and working together to create a new future, in the course of which we've received recognition by winning a number of national awards. This future, though, is incompatible with schemes to encircle our hills and our valley with a ring of steel. Being part of a community so spirited, generous and united in the face of enormous pressure has been a moving and a humbling experience, more so than I can properly express in words. We are not a wind resource. This is our home, the background and the foundation of our lives and our future. Our experience of the would-be wind turbine developers and of aspects of the planning system has not been a happy one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Gibson. My apologies for not recognising you wanted to speak there. I appreciate Community Against Turbines have an interest mainly in wind, but I think I have to remind you that, of course, this is an inquiry into renewable energy more generally. I think one of the issues that members of the committee will want to explore is what alternatives there are to wind and what other forms of renewable energy you might have an interest in promoting. A number of issues have been touched in your opening submissions. Both parties have mentioned the issue of tourism. I think that is where we would like to start. And I'm going to invite Chick Brodie if he would offer the first question.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. I'd like firstly to ask Mr Mark Gibson a question, if I may, and in doing so, as a fellow man from Ayrshire, I'd like to congratulate you on the community success that you've had at Craigengillan. I would start, however, by saying that, having attended recently the Ayrshire Tourism Partnership and Dumfries and Galloway Tourism Conference, there was no mention of onshore wind at all, and I found both very positive meetings. However, Mr Gibson, if we don't do something different in Scotland, which can be a major net exporter of electricity and power, we would then become, and very quickly, a net importer, and we'll have a dependency on countries like China, Russia and the Middle East for energy supply, with all the consequences that that would have for our economy and the sectors within it, particularly tourism. Thorium is experimental, not yet developed. Uranium will be depleted in 40 years if China and India continue their nuclear development at the current rate. The cost of nuclear is unpredictable and high when you add decommissioning costs and fully burdened insurance costs as opposed to government guarantees. So that's not a viable option. Coal will leave us at the mercy of Russia, Colombia, South Africa and Indonesia, and gas at the mercy of Qatar. To this committee in 2008, Mr Gibson, you had indicated a combination of wind, although not onshore wind, hydro, biomass, tidal, wave and clean coal combined with strong energy measures are what we need to secure Scotland's energy security and economy in the long term. Do you still agree with that? And what do you think the benefits are, therefore, for Scotland's economy?
It's a very long question. Could you just distill it into one sentence?
What I'm saying is that we want to be a net export of power, of which is with a balanced energy mix, including offshore wind, wave, tidal, biomass, etc. I mean, you made that comment in 2008. Do you still agree with that, or have you changed your views?
I believe in an energy mix, certainly. There's, at the moment, the entire focus of government policy is on, and the only way of achieving the targets which you set yourselves is through onshore wind. It's the only technology which is sufficiently advanced to get us there by 2020. It would be a disastrous mistake, I think. What we need is a whole system review. Are we doing this for energy security? Are we doing it to save the planet? If so, we have no idea of what CO2 savings there might be, and if they weren't made, what the effects would be. Nobody has done the most elementary preliminary study. You cannot have more than about 10 or 12% of the total energy, electricity, from wind, because it's intermittent and the grid becomes unstable. And to cope with those times, which can sometimes be very prolonged, when the wind isn't blowing at the right speed, you've got to have backup power stations. Those backup power stations are therefore working intermittently. They decelerate when the wind happens to blow. They accelerate when the wind stops. It means they're working totally inefficiently, just like a car engine. And there comes a point at about 30% contribution from wind when the CO2 generation and greenhouse gas generation is greater than if there had been no wind farms at all. So it doesn't work for energy security, and it doesn't work for the environment.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if I may move to Mr. Sewell and Mr. Trump. Good morning. Welcome. Gentlemen, against the backdrop of a 9% increase in tourism visits to Scotland last year, new Visit Scotland research, which shows 80% of UK respondents state their decision to holiday in Scotland would not be affected by the presence of onshore or offshore wind. 70% of Scots support wind as part of our energy mix. Whiteley Wind Farm, the largest in Europe, has had 210,000 visitors since it opened in 2009. You mentioned birds, Mr. Trump. The RSPB say their members are genuinely supporters of wind farms, having announced plans, indeed, they themselves have announced plans for a wind turbine at their headquarters in Bedfordshire. And indeed, they've been citing growth in numbers of skylarks, etc. We've had similar comments from other organisations like WWF Scotland, etc. Another confusion in the backdrop is your letter, Mr. Trump, to Mr. Losheth of 14th of December supporting wind farms, and then the confusion of Mr. Sorial saying you'd had scores of letters supporting your organisation, and you yourself saying you'd had thousands of letters. So that's kind of confusing. You mentioned Ireland. Ireland has plans to meet 40% of its power needs from renewables in 2020, with the vast bulk coming from offshore wind. Against these backdrops and any others, I wonder if you can confirm to us the detailed analysis explaining who produced it, when they produced it, and will you share it with the committee, this analysis that supports the many assertions that you've made against wind?
Let me just state that the letter said appropriately located wind. It didn't say wind, it said appropriately located wind, drawn by our lawyer. And if somebody wants to go through and subsidize a wind farm in an appropriate location, which in my opinion has to be in an industrial location, if you have an industrial location and if you want to support it for the rest of your lives, if you want the UK to support it, because frankly that's who is subsidizing support, that's fine with me. But I don't think you should ruin your countryside. I don't think you should ruin the looks and the great beauty of Scotland, which is one of its great assets, if not its single greatest asset, with this. In fact, I noticed coming in, they go, come home to Aberdeen. They have a big campaign, and they have pictures of magnificent fields and magnificent cathedrals and all of this. And I said to all of the people that were following me at the airport, where are the windmills? I don't see any windmills. They have fields. They have cathedrals. They have everything. They must have 15 different pictures of beautiful sites, not one windmill. I said, where are the windmills? It's false advertising. And I can tell you this. I am an expert at tourism, as you know, and I gave a list of the awards. I've won many, many awards. In fact, I just built a hotel in Chicago that Travel and Leisure said the best hotel in North America. I've won many, many awards over the last short period of time, let alone long period of time. My clubs are rated among the best in the world. I have 5-star, 5-diamond, in some cases 6-star clubs, and it's the only one in the category. I am an expert on tourism. If you dot your landscape with these horrible, horrible structures, you will do tremendous damage.
My question is, where is the clinical evidence? Not an opinion, an empirical assessment. Where is your clinical evidence? Who has produced it? Will you share it with the committee?
Well, first of all, I am the evidence. I think I'm more of an expert. You know what? I think I'm a lot more of an expert than the people that you'd like me to hire, who are doing it to make a paycheck. But I am an expert in tourism. I am considered a world-class expert in tourism. So when you say, where is the expert and where is the evidence, I'm the evidence.
Right. But would anyone honestly believe that an industrial power plant is going to become a tourist attraction? I mean, that assertion is absolutely absurd. Would you suggest we put a hotel in front of St. Fergus? I mean, that's essentially what you're saying.
Right. Let me just test that. Because I think this has probably got more to do with property values, having looked at your accounts through the year end December 2010, although I don't necessarily personally subscribe to it, but I think property values have a lot to do with it. But let's test the golf tourism thing. In the past week, I've talked to 6 major Open Championship club secretaries, 3 on the east coast of Scotland. Some are concerned about wind power, but we'll work through the planning process if it should affect them. However, I did talk to the Secretary of Royal St George's at Sandwich, Kent, which has a 100-turbine farm 7 miles away, I admit, further away than. Can we just have one witness, please? One advisor? One advisor?
It's quite all right for notes to be passed from the row.
So, having talked to Royal St George's, when you talk about industrial power, they used to have a coal-fired power station right next to it. They knocked that down, built a wind turbine. That's now been knocked down because they're building an energy green park, which will include turbines. The view is it will not affect the golf there at all. So how do you arrive at your decision? I know you're the expert, Mr. Trump, but where is the evidence that supports the statement you've just made?
I say they're wrong, and we'll see what happens. All you have to do is take a little walk over to Royal Aberdeen and see how that course has been decimated. It's not going to hold any more championships. It can't hold any more championships.
It's on the open rota.
Wait till you see Royal Aberdeen. You go over and take a look at what happened to Royal Aberdeen in the last 48 hours, and I think even you, who obviously is biased, but I think even you will say that that course is decimated. There won't be tournaments there. There won't be championships there. One of the great jewels of Scotland has been devastated. And I know this, the people at Turnberry are fighting like mad not to have the windmills built. They are fighting like mad.
Oh, funny, I talked to him.
Mr. Bowes, you've had the chance to ask your questions. I'm going to bring in Mr. Lang, who wants to respond to this, and I've got other members who want to ask questions.
Yes, there were two points, a little reference to tourism. Mr. Leckie of the Scottish Tourism Alliance has said we need empirical evidence. Visit Scotland hastily published wind farm consumer research, which appeared yesterday like a rabbit out the hat, is certainly not empirical evidence. The Moffat report is out of date. There could be a real chance to do something thoughtful on this, and it should be perhaps commissioned by an independent source, not the government. Mr. Brodie also mentioned alternatives, and of course a sustainable energy hierarchy is the best framework for tackling that. Demand reduction, of course, using less energy in the first place, energy efficiency and conservation, using energy more efficiently, particularly through insulation and efficient appliances. And I could go on and on. There's many, many different ways of tackling the thing. He also mentioned thorium nuclear, and that is a very viable possibility if the government should be looking at.
Come on later in the session to talk about alternatives. I think I'd rather just address.
I just followed up on the mention of
fair enough.
thorium.
I want to address specifically tourism issues at the start, and we've got another member, Mr. McKenzie, wants to come in on this point.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Trump. I'm interested in your views on tourism, but part of the area I represent include the Orkney Islands. And I don't know if you've had the pleasure of visiting the Orkneys, but I'm sure you would agree with me that that's a wonderful part of Scotland. You might be surprised to know that the Orkney Islands already generate 100% of their electricity requirement from onshore wind. And yet, if you did have the opportunity of visiting, I'm sure you would agree with me that the landscape is not overburdened by wind turbines. And very interestingly, Orkney's tourism grows and has grown for a number of years well beyond the Scottish average. It's a very important industry there. They do it very, very well. I would suggest that you go and visit Orkney, because there are various types of tourism. And I wonder just how you explain those two phenomena that are able to seemingly coexist. Onshore wind generation to the level of Orkney already meeting the government targets, and increasing and improving tourism.
Well, from what I understand, you have a very tiny population, and in a certain case where you have a tiny population, a couple of windmills can do something and it can take care of that. But appropriately located industrial turbines, as I've said, are okay. The problem is they can't. You lose money. You lose a tremendous amount of money. And frankly, without the UK subsidy, and this is what's happening all over, without a UK subsidy, and I made the statement to the paper, Scotland, if you pursue this goal of these monsters all over Scotland, Scotland will go broke. As sure as you're sitting there, Scotland will go broke. They're being subsidized massively right now by the UK. And without that subsidy, and if the UK decide, excuse me, can I finish? If the UK decides that they're not going to further subsidize all of these windmills, Scotland will go broke.
I'm sorry, but I don't think you quite answered my question. My question was, and I think everybody would agree that the Orkneys are not an industrial landscape, they're very much a rural landscape, and yet they can generate 100% of their wind energy. But the question I asked is that this seems to coexist very happily with their tourism industry, and you haven't explained that. You've made the other points before, but I'd ask you to specifically address that question.
I don't know what your tourism industry is. I don't know the area that you're talking about. All I can say is that most of the important and major golf courses and most of the tourist areas are fighting this like mad. These gentlemen know exactly what I'm saying. They know it better than I particularly, but I will say smart areas that want to remain beautiful and want to remain viable as a tourism area are fighting the industrial turbines looming over their properties. And by the way, a woman who works for me, very wonderful woman, she came to see me. She's devastated. Why? They put a turbine, a small one, behind her house. She can't sleep at night because of the noise. The flutter, as you know, the flutter. She can't sleep at night. She doesn't know what to do. She came to me. What do I do? Nobody wants to buy my house. This is happening by the tens of thousands all over Scotland. So I think you really ought to take a look. And I'll bet you that if I went to your community, and I'm sure it's lovely, but if I went to your community and if I spoke to people in your community, they would not be happy with what's happened.
And you currently...
Mr. Lang, who wants to answer that question.
Yes, I know where the constituency of the member for Highlands and Islands, and I know where he lives, in Easdale, I think. And I know that part of Scotland very well, and I've had a few pints in the Tea and a Truish at Clachan. And now he'll know that the Rera wind farm that was applied for very near to there, just at the side of the road, was refused planning permission. And there's now another wind farm application for 9 turbines just above Clachan. And I had a look at the planning website there, and it's not been on the planning very long. There are 900 objections. And nothing like 900 people live in Easdale or Clachan or roundabout. And most of these objections come from the leisure industry, people who sail, people who enjoy that coast. And having looked at the visualizations, which usually underplay the impact is devastating. Looking from behind Clachan towards Cruachan and from the village, it's just dreadful. And the view from Clachan, it's not really going to be helped much by 9 dancing ladies. They're not members of the Tiller Girls.
Kenzie wants to come back in briefly.
I'm sorry yet again that you haven't. I'm very grateful to you for attempting to answer the question, but you really didn't address the question that I did ask. But what I would then do is direct you to you mentioned the dancing ladies. And I had the privilege of going down there shortly after these wind turbines were switched on with communities from all over Scotland. GIA and the Dancing Ladies were Scotland's first community-owned wind turbine development. And that has brought about a huge amount of benefit to the people of GIA, who universally love their dancing ladies. Would you deny, and Mr Trump, you might feel free to answer this as well, would you deny islands like GIA that opportunity to benefit from this technology?
First of all, I have no idea whether or not they like them. If they do, I'd be very surprised. I'll take your word for it, but I would personally be very surprised. It's your community, but I would be very surprised if they like them.
It's a matter of public record, Mr.
Okay, I'm sure it is.
Well, you're talking too about, what, 20 to 30 turbines there? If the First Minister gets his way, you're building another 8 to 10,000. So it's not necessarily what you have now. It's what you propose to build over the next 4 or 5 years to achieve your renewable goals. And just to answer your question about tourism, 1 turbine was put next to Royal Aberdeen, 1, and it caused such outrage that the chairman of the Infrastructure Services Committee called for a 6-month moratorium on all future applications. And I think you're going to see a lot more of that all around Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Now, Mr. Lang or Mr. Gibson,
just to reply
perhaps
directly to what Mr. Mackenzie said, yes, I think the dancing ladies on GIA are fine. 3 turbines fit in very well, and they generate electricity for electrical needs on the island. The turbines on Egg are also embedded into the local network, and that's very acceptable, although when the wind doesn't blow and the rain doesn't fall, they don't have any wind, they don't have any hydro, so they have to start up their diesel generators again because they're not part of the national grid network. I think that some turbines on Lewis is absolutely acceptable, and some turbines on Shetland is absolutely acceptable, but not on the scale that's proposed. If they were embedded into the local network to provide electricity and benefits for the local communities, and they're pretty big in Lewis and in Shetland, I would quite support that.
Mr. Kennedy, I'd like to move on to other members coming in. Patrick Harvey, I think you had a question on tourism.
Just very briefly, thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. Just to follow up this issue about coexistence of the tourism industry and renewables, and to follow up on Chick Brody's point. Chick mentioned Royal St George's Golf Club, which has, George Sorial, I think, used the term industrial power station. Let me show you a picture of the defunct coal power plant, plus 1 older turbine, very clearly visible from one of the holes. Now, with this view, this golf course somehow miraculously managed to attract a succession of international events. Can I put it to you that perhaps most people just don't look at it if they don't like the look of it on the horizon?
They don't like the look, they go to a different country or a different place.
But this is a golf
there's certainly nothing very attractive about that.
But this is a golf course which attracted a succession, including, I think it's had 14 in total, Open Championships, including one last year.
Certainly not an asset, what you just showed me there. That I can tell you.
And that's been there for a long time, right? That's
Indeed.
not something that was recently erected. what you're talking about just off of our coastline, for example, is also 650 feet, 65-story structures, a mile and a half off the coast. Again, do you believe that your eye's not going to be drawn to that?
I believe that this was compatible with a course which attracted a succession of international events over many years.
Yes.
Secondly, they don't have moving blades which attract your eye to.
Okay.
Well, the turbine.
Could I make I think you made your point, Mr. Harvey. Okay, Mr. Gibson, briefly, please.
Right. I agree that an up-to-date, proper independent survey is needed. It's come out very clearly in various comments this morning. We don't have enough actual written evidence. We have the evidence of Mr. Trump, and the evidence of an operator, in a way, is the best because they know their market. But we do need evidence for occasions such as this. My own experience is that there's been a shift. At the beginning, 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago, a lot of people were prepared to consider the effect on the landscape of wind turbines because they believed, one, that it was good for the energy security of the country, but more importantly, they believed it was important in the battle against climate change and for the environment. Since then, and at an increasing rate, hardly a fortnight goes by without one professional engineering body, financial body or another coming up and saying this policy will not work. If people think they've got to put up with that for something which just enriches foreign companies but doesn't help the environment, that affects very much their attitude to wind farms, and that's why I think an up-to-date survey is needed.
Right, thank you. I'd like to move on to a different subject, if I may. Mr. Trump, I was reading the submission you made to the inquiry where you detail your concerns about the proposed offshore wind development in Aberdeenshire. And you make a number of comments in this I'd like to draw to your attention. You say the Scottish Government has an obligation to honour its contracts, and you go on to say Scotland, at the very highest ministerial level, encouraged me with overwhelming promises, public statements and various offers to support. Can I ask you, what were these promises that were made to you? When were they made and who made them?
When I first came to Scotland, my mother, by the way, was born on the Isle of Lewis, so I know something about it. But when I first came to Scotland, I had an option to buy this piece of land. I was going to buy this piece of land, and I heard there was going to be a big wind farm built off the almost 2,000 acres of land that we're talking about. And I said, that's okay, but I'm not going to build there. I spoke to Jack McConnell at the time, who was your first minister, and there were people talking about putting, believe it or not, the dunes that that I so cherish and we now call the Great Dunes of Scotland, that have gotten all of these awards and are getting all of these great awards. And we've been very, very careful environmentally. We've done a very environmentally sensitive job. But we were going to go, and we said, that's okay if you want to build it, because we're not going to build here. We're going to go to another place. We just won't buy this land. We'll go someplace else. And we actually had a great piece of land in Ireland. And it wasn't my first choice, but it was a great piece of land. And if you remember, and there was big hoopla, I was going to go and I was going to leave and I was going to build in Ireland because of the fact that the wind farm was going to be built fairly near our course in Scotland, on the piece of land on which we built. And as Jack McConnell said, it won't be built. And his people were telling George or various of my people that it won't happen. They talked about the Ministry of Defense would never approve it because it had something to do with the radar. And they talked about the shipping lanes, especially because it's near Aberdeen. They said it won't happen. It was very prevalent for a short period of time, and then it totally disappeared. Based on that, nothing in writing, but based on that, I decided I'll go forward. In the meantime, Alex Salmon, when I discussed it with him toward the beginning, he poo-pooed it and said, you have a Ministry of Defense problem, you have all sorts of shipping lane problems. I wouldn't worry about that. and I continued to go forward. Now I've invested tens of millions of pounds. I've completed my site ahead of schedule. I've built something that is spectacular by even my enemies say the most spectacular and really good, going to be great for Scotland, going to be great for Aberdeen, going to be great for everything. So after I've invested this tremendous amount of money, all of a sudden this really obnoxious and ugly wind farm appears, which is worse than a wind farm because they're going to have all these different looking windmills up there. It's going to look like Disneyland, except a bad version of Disneyland. And so I felt betrayed because I invested my money. I invested my money based on statements that were made to me. And then I get a letter from Alex Salmond just a short time ago, April 12th. And in one of his parts of the letter, as I explained, the policies of one government do not bind its successor. So what he's saying is, well, if Jack told you that this isn't going to happen, or if people in his administration told you, we're not bound by it. Now, lots of very smart people with a lot of money are looking to invest in different parts of the world. When they see what happened to me and the way I've been treated, they're not going to be investing in Scotland. Because when you make the statement that just because one administration says something, well, I have to rely on that. If Jack McConnell says to me and his representatives say to us that that won't happen, and then it goes away, and then I build and invest all this money, and then it reemerges, I don't think that's fair to an investor.
I mean, clearly this was a matter of great importance to you, that this development did not go ahead to affect your golf course.
By the way, if it went ahead, it was fine. I told them that. I was going to build in Ireland, and all of a sudden it disappeared.
The question, Mr. Trump, is if it was so important to you, why did you not seek something more than just a verbal assurance?
Well, I didn't think it was necessary because they talked about Ministry of Defense, and which, by the way, is totally opposed to the Vattenfall wind farm, as you know, the Ministry of Defense. And they also talked about the shipping lanes. And that's always been a big problem. And the Ministry of Defense has recently come out totally against the Vattenfall wind farm. So I feel very good about that. But I was told that a while ago. So I didn't feel it was necessary. And Alex Salmond mentioned that the same way. I didn't feel it was necessary. When they say Ministry of Defense is against it, what do I need? So what they did is they lured me in. I spent this money, and now I might regret it. And I think other people that want to invest in Scotland are watching me, and they're watching what happened, and I think they're going to say, I'm not going to invest in Scotland.
It has been suggested, Mr. Trump, that when you proposed this development back in 2006, 2007, we were in a different economic time. A development which at that time might have appeared to be economically viable might look different today, given the economic recession we've seen, and that really you change your mind about this development and all you're looking for is an excuse to withdraw, and this is just a face-saving exercise. How would you respond to that?
Well, even Alex Salmond was quoted today as that they're satisfied with what Mr. Trump did. He's in, I think, the Times today quoted that he's satisfied with what we've done. Look, I've invested tens of millions of pounds with no debt. I have no debt on the site. You can check. No mortgage, no financing, no nothing. I've invested, unlike most other projects that are going down the tubes, they're going bust. I've invested tens of millions of pounds into my close to 2,000-acre site on the North Sea. I've created something that's magnificent. I've created what some people and myself are considering the best golf course anywhere in the world. That's what I said I was going to do because we had the painting, we had the canvas to do it. I am looking forward to proceeding with the job. And I want to build a hotel. I want to build further. I don't want to stop. We're a very rich organization. We're a very substantial organization. This is a very small job for me. This is not a big job. It's an important job. My mother was born in Scotland, and it's an important job for me, but it's not a big job for me. You know that as soon as this horrendous idea of these 11 all different colors, different styles, different looks, windmills are terminated. 1 mile. One other thing. Now it's 1 mile away. When I first got involved, they were 10 miles away. Then they were 3 miles away. Now it's 1 mile away. And as this gentleman told me a little while ago, 1 mile isn't even really a sea wind. It's really on the coast. It's really on land. Because 1 mile, this is the equivalent of a 70-story building, 11 of them, and each one different. So there's not a man or woman sitting on this council that if they were in my position, they got lured in to make an investment. I made an investment because of the beauty of the site and the beauty of the views and all of those things. And then after I've spent my money, they come and they announce this atrocious plan. And I just have to tell you one other thing. Wind is not a good form of energy, and it doesn't work without subsidy. So I think this is just an observation that I make as a businessman that's done well. I think you have to be very careful, because if the UK ever takes away your subsidy, you have got some major problems on your hand.
Thank you, Mr. Trump. I've got other members who want to come in on this line of questioning. Just one final question, which I think is only fair to put to you, and that is, as I'm sure you're aware, both Jack McConnell, now Lord McConnell, and the current First Minister, Mr. Salmon, deny that they ever gave you these assurances.
Well, I've heard that, and I know Mr. Salmon's denying other things today on the front page, not related to this particular
But why should we believe you and not believe them?
So, you know, I mean, because, hey, he is denying other things today. He's denying everything. Obviously, they even said that I wanted windmills. You know, somebody came out and said, who would want them? I never wanted them. I was always opposed to them. Now, they asked me if I'd write a letter in appropriate locations. Yeah, if they want to put them in industrial areas, that's fine. I think they're bad only because you're going to lose money. I believe in hydro. I think hydro for Scotland is great. I think you should expand your hydro energy. I think wave technology, great. I think you should expand. That's what you should be doing. But I think you're going to destroy your coastline. You're going to destroy. Jack McConnell told me that. Alex Salmon told me. He scoffed at the idea. At a dinner we had in New York. We were in New York at a dinner. By the way, Mr. Suriel was there.
I was there.
We had a dinner. We talked for hours. We were at a dinner. We talked about windmills. Who would believe we didn't talk about windmills? When I originally bought the site, when I heard that windmills were going to be there, I would have built in Ireland. Very simple.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. Mr. Trump, you say you were given these assurances. The former and current First Ministers say that that wasn't the case. This committee can't really resolve that. It's one person's word against another. But let's just, I'd like to probe, we know you don't like the project, the wind project. We know that. But what you've said to us today, I'd like to probe a little bit further. You said you had the option to buy the land. You heard there would be the development, and I think the phrase you used was, we said we just won't buy this land and it won't be built. And then you were given the assurances about the European Offshore Wind Deployment Centre.
Disappeared, amazingly, because they wanted my money. They wanted me to invest in Scotland, which is the right thing.
Can I just
finish?
And then, after you were given that assurance, you bought the land.
Yes.
Well, the Registers of Scotland document shows that you had date of entry on the land in January, I believe, 2006. In February 2006, you were seeking advice from Scottish Development International about the wind farm, which you described as a deal killer, by which time you had already acquired the bulk of the land for £4.5 million. And later on that month as well, I think on the 21st of February 2006, SDI, following discussions with yourselves, you sent an email saying that our client, whose name must remain confidential at about this stage, is about to conclude within the next few days a deal on a tourism leisure resort of international standing. Now, in the next few days, after 21st of February, you had already bought the land.
I was given assurances prior to my buying the land, and frankly,
prior to January 2006.
Yes, I was given.
When?
I don't know. I mean, you're talking about many years ago, but I was given assurances to a point where I felt I could go ahead and buy the land because I didn't think the wind was going to happen. I didn't think that the wind farm was going to happen by the time I bought the land.
And so, why, following discussions with yourselves, did SDI describe the wind farm as a deal killer?
I don't know, maybe it was continuing onward a little bit, but I felt confident. By the time I bought the land, I felt confident that the wind farm was not going to happen. I felt it for a lot of different reasons, including I had heard that the Ministry of Defense was against it, which meant a lot to me. But I had felt quite confident by the time I bought the land that the wind farms were not going to happen.
You're a wealthy enough man to be able to afford a lawyer to explain to you that it would have been completely outrageous and improper for a First Minister to give such a future assurance about a planning application or an energy
I don't think so at all.
Which didn't exist.
I don't think so at all. I think that what the First Minister wanted to do, and frankly, Alex Salmond wanted me very much to invest in Scotland also, for a lot of reasons, and good reasons. That's not bad reasons, that's good reasons. They want me to put hundreds of
legal obligations.
Excuse me. They want me to put hundreds of millions of pounds into Scotland. What isn't right is to get them to do something and then go against their word. Go ahead.
Yes, I want to come in here. I think this line of questioning is absolutely ludicrous. This isn't the Trump inquiry. It's to do with renewable energy and the government's targets. And these attacks on Mr. Trump are completely out of order.
The reason these questions have come up, Mr. Lang, is because these comments were made in Mr. Trump's submission to the committee, and therefore it's quite legitimate for the committee to raise questions about them. But I don't want to dwell on this. I know Mr. Macmillan wants to come in with a brief question, and if I have time, we'll allow Maureen Watt with a brief question on this.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. Mr. Trump, it's regarding the written evidence. On page 6, paragraph 2, the final sentence, you say that if I had known about the current wind turbine proposals, I would never have built in Scotland. Yet, a few moments ago, you actually said that you did know about them.
I knew about them, but I didn't think they were going to happen, because I was led to believe they wouldn't happen.
So you knew about them, but in your written statement you actually said that if you had have known, so that implies...
Well, no, if I had known that they were going to build them. I knew, look, when I was going to buy, this is years ago, when I was going to buy, there was talk about a wind farm. I said, that's okay, build it, but I'm not buying. By the time I bought, I felt secure, and then I felt secure for a period of time. Then all of a sudden, after the money was invested, in other words, they got me to come in, I invested my money, I built something magnificent beyond what I said I was going to do. It opens on July 10th, and I did something beyond, I had to bring that up, but it is, and it could open now, we're actually ahead of schedule. And what happened is, after I invested tremendous amounts of money in this and completed it, then all of a sudden this starts to come. So I think it's now it started to come before I completed it, but it really emerged after I started investing a tremendous amount of money. And now we're stuck with this terrible Vattenfall project. And I think it's terrible. I think it's a terrible way to treat a person investing tens of millions of pounds in Scotland.
So just to clarify then, what you've said this morning is factually accurate, but what you've put in your written statement is not totally accurate.
Well, I think they sort of mesh, don't they? I mean,
no,
you're splitting hairs. Our opposition to wind power is well documented and well known. If you just do any quick research, you're going to find articles identical to the ones being written today from early 2006. So Mr. Trump has made his point that had we known the proposals would go forward, we would never have done this project. So you're splitting hairs. Your point doesn't make any sense. And Mr. Harvey, your reference to that email, why don't you ask SDI that question? They wrote the email. The email wasn't to us. It was from SDI to the Scottish government. It's not reasonable for you to ask us to speculate on what they meant by that. That is absolutely ridiculous.
Very briefly.
Well, I think it's fair to have a very brief response to that.
Very briefly, the point that I was making was that following discussions with yourselves, with the Trump Organisation, SDI were very clearly under the impression that the deal was about to be completed in a few days.
It is hearsay.
Sorry, we'd let Ms. Harvey please ask his question.
That the SDI were clearly under the impression, following discussions with yourselves, that the deal would be completed in a few days, and that was written on the 21st of February.
It's hearsay. Were we copied on that email? It was an email from SDI to the Scottish government. How would you even bring it up? It has no bearing on this hearing. It's ridiculous.
Okay. Well, I think Maureen Watt wanted to ask a question. Please, very briefly, if you would, Maureen.
Yes, thank you very much, Convener. And I've first appearance at this committee, so I have no declaration to make in terms of interests. Mr Trump, I was from 2006 to last election a regional member for the North East, and I followed both projects, been to all the consultations for both projects, and I have the timelines here for both projects. And the wind farm project has been on the go since 2002. In 2005-06, there were 20 public consultations in towns along the coast of Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. You purchased the property in March 2006. And from 2006 to 2009, the wind farm project was developing, and it got European backing, became the European Offshore Wind Deployment Centre. All along, you've known that both projects were continuing, and you had a chance to pull out, but you didn't.
No, I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's correct at all. The Vattenfall project, I believe, came in much later than that. And certainly we didn't know about it. I didn't know about it. It's just like Royal Aberdeen didn't know about it. They didn't know that a windmill was going to be built right next to their course until it was built. I certainly didn't know that.
And your First Minister consistently led us to believe that because of issues with shipping lanes going into the harbor and MOD radar issues, that the proposal would never go forward. I think any reasonable person, when getting assurances from the head of a government based on those grounds, could certainly rely on them. And that is exactly what happened here.
All those projects were being worked out locally.
I think we've had to address that issue. It was an important issue to address, but we do now need to move on to broader issues of policy, and I'm going to invite John Park.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. I'd like to take us into an area that we've just touched on a little bit, and it is about the alternatives to us meeting the targets that the government have set. In every session that we've had so far, when people come and give evidence, and this morning, we've never heard anyone make any complaint about the renewable targets that the Scottish Government have set and the rationale behind them. So I'd appreciate if you could give us an idea of any thinking that your organisations have about how we might meet these renewable targets if we're not to include the concerns that you have around wind, whether it be onshore or offshore.
I don't particularly see the point. In fact, it's a very dangerous way to go ahead, to have a policy which is based on targets for percentages of renewable energy rather than what is that going to achieve. It's not going to achieve energy security because the wind doesn't blow all the time. It's not going to achieve, as far as we know, any environmental outcomes. It could actually result, as I said earlier, in greater levels of CO2 than if there weren't any turbines. I say turbines, wind turbines, because that's the only technology which has a chance of being able to meet those 2020 targets. There has been no empirical evidence whatsoever about levels of CO2 reduction or increase. We've had no cost-benefit analysis. What is the policy for? It's not for security. It's not for the environment. I'll tell you one shocking story of a recent application we had. We have 3 sites of special scientific interest next to us. Every winter, between 47 and 50 pairs of whooper swans nest there. During the daytime, they migrate between the loch and a smaller loch in the centre of a wind farm application site. I asked the developer if he was aware of the whooper swans. He said, "Oh yeah, no problem, we're going to drain the loch on our land." That is the typical attitude. Bats get sucked into the low-pressure vacuum. They can't escape. Their lungs literally implode. And for what? For nothing. SNH have no evidence. They say they support government policy. I have written correspondence with them saying that they have no evidence that it does anything worthwhile, nor have they sought any evidence. The same comes from Historic Scotland. It's a policy for policy's sake with no clear outcomes at all and no evidence.
I might add, though, that from a practical standpoint, I think your CO2 targets are absolutely ridiculous. China is decimating the atmosphere. They're decimating what's going on up in the air. And your targets are, you are less than 1%, if that. And yet China, where you buy your unattractive industrial wind turbines, is decimating the atmosphere, absolutely decimating. And here you are, destroying the financial well-being of Scotland, destroying it in order to meet phony and totally random CO2 targets. And you have a company that's making your turbines. And by the way, China, they love making turbines for Scotland and getting Scotland to pay them a lot of money. But China is decimating the atmosphere and doing so much damage to the atmosphere that there's nothing you can do at all to bring it back by your so-called wind initiative. Now, renewable, again, fine. Wind, fine, if it's in the right location, if it's properly located. But for you to be setting targets when China and certain other countries are decimating the atmosphere, I think it's very foolhardy.
US.
Excuse me?
Like the US.
Sorry, Mr. Brody. Please no.
Perhaps like the US, yes.
Yeah.
Hey, perhaps like the US.
Wind has failed all over the United States as well. It's failed everywhere.
By the way, I have to say this. You're 20 years behind the times because other countries are giving up industrial turbines. They're going to other forms of energy. They're giving them up. And you have wind farms all over the world that are being abandoned. And as soon as the government stops subsidizing them, the wind farm doesn't work because they're very, very poor. People aren't doing them. So you're really 20 years behind the time.
Okay, can I just remind members, please, to speak through the chair? John Park.
I don't know if Mr Lang wanted to come there and say anything. I think you started to talk about some of the alternatives in one of your earlier questions, so maybe you could elaborate on that.
Just to correct one thing, wind is not an alternative. It's an additional source of energy, an additional source of electricity, so that's something that has to be understood. It's not an alternative, and that is, as you all know, why it's intermittent and it requires backup. When turbines are generating, the backup is ticking over, and when the turbines are not working, which is at least 70% of the time, nuclear, gas and coal provides our electricity. I did mention a sustainable energy hierarchy, which is demand reduction, energy efficiency, renewable microenergy, combined heat and power, heat pumps, solar, wind, both heat and electricity, small-scale renewables, community renewables, with income reinvested locally for projects up the hierarchy for both heat and electricity. The important point is that most effort and funding should go into the higher levels of the hierarchy, where they will be most effective at reducing emissions and fuel poverty. I did mention thorium, and as I said, we were being left behind by the USA, China, India and Australia, who all have research programs. The reaction is not a runaway chain reaction, so it does not require a pressurized reactor. The raw material is readily available from Western countries and is very abundant. It requires an external source to begin a reaction, so it can be shut down immediately. There's no significant radioactivity, and the heat at the reactor is only 400 degrees centigrade, and very small reactors can be safely built. And that really is all I have to say about alternatives, unless you want to ask.
Can I just get one clarification before I move on to my final question? I mean, Mr Trump made the position of his organisation clear in terms of how he believes our energy targets are ones that are probably unachievable and we shouldn't have set them. What is the position of communities against turbines on the Scottish Government's energy target?
Well, we see from, and you'll see from our submission, that we accept the figures produced by Scottish Natural Heritage, that with what has been built, what's been consented and what is in the pipeline, and perhaps at scoping and screening, the target should be met. But as SNH have also said, it's going to be more... Pardon?
Do you support it? Do you support the target?
No.
Right.
What is it for?
That's fine. That's just
what is the target for?
That's right.
Is it for energy? Is it for job creation? It seems to change every week. Is it for the environment? What are the targets for?
And the job creation is jobs in China. because they're the ones that make the windmills.
I think we've heard that point, Mr. Trump. Thank you.
2 minutes.
John Park. Last question, John Park.
Yeah, last question. Thank you, Convener. Obviously, it's about the nature of employment in Scotland over the years. We've seen a lot of demographic change. Scotland has been a manufacturing country and is one that we hope will manufacture again. We've had some bad news about Doosan lately, but you've Gamesa, Samsung, Bifab, Scottish and Southern Energy, a whole host of companies who are investing in Scotland, particularly looking at offshore wind, and will provide high-quality manufacturing jobs. I come back to the premise of my earlier question. If it is about providing, meeting our renewables targets, but it is also about the reindustrialisation of our country, and if we're not doing that, what are the alternatives? Is it employment in tourism or other sectors?
How are we reindustrialising? The government also talks about investment, 750 million, billion, whatever. That money is not coming into Scotland. That money is going to buying foreign manufactured wind turbines installed by foreign-owned companies, about 85%. Where are the jobs? Where is the investment locally? There isn't any. You see it, our nearest wind farm, 60 turbines, Scottish Power, owned by Iberdrola, a Spanish company. Every single construction worker was Spanish. We've seen at the public inquiry the developer was claiming ever more jobs every single day, up to 120 by the end, long-term jobs. We were taken to a site during the inquiry report. The reporter asked the operator, Scottish Power, how many jobs on this 60 turbine site? 3. He said, are they all employed here? Oh no, they spread their time between 4 different wind farms, so there was less than 1 job. Job creation is a cruel bribe to people desperate for jobs, and it's a false one. What are the targets for? They're not for employment, they're not for the environment, they're not for energy security. What are they there for?
Mr. Lang.
The answer to that is to export electricity, in theory. And of course, that's a pretty impossible card to call at this stage, because we don't know where the market will be, and if it will be. How do we know that the English are going to queue up to buy our renewable electricity when they probably have some of their own? They have an agreement with Ireland to import all their renewable wind from offshore off the west coast of Ireland if it's ever built. And basically, the theory of being able, if you haven't got a market, you can't export something. So what's the point in making a product if you aren't absolutely certain you can export it?
Angus MacDonald.
Okay, thank you, Convener. Good morning, panel. First of all, before I actually get into my question, could I perhaps correct yourself, Mr. Trump? A couple of minutes ago you said that we were perhaps 20 years behind with regard to wind energy. Now, I would draw to your attention our Nordic cousins, particularly in Norway, who have plans to significantly increase the number of onshore wind turbines throughout the country. So if we are 20 years behind, then so is Norway.
Well, that's not what I'm hearing about Norway, by the way. And if you look at Germany, if you look at Spain, and if you look at other countries, they are abandoning wind. And the reason is because they can't afford to subsidize it. Spain has obviously got economic problems. What they've done is they've announced they cannot subsidize any longer, and because of that, the wind farms are being closed up. So you have to be very careful. I will say this. I just returned from the country of Georgia, and it is considered one of the great achievements over the last 10 or 15 years. People are going there. Leaders of other countries are going to see what the president of Georgia and his people have done. It's amazing. I asked him about wind. He didn't even want to talk about it. He thought it was ridiculous. But what he has done is gone almost 100% hydro. And hydro is fabulous. It's fabulous energy. It's not intermittent. You can turn it off anytime you want. And I think, just as a recommendation to this committee, I think you should seriously study hydro. You have tremendous water resources. I think you should seriously study hydro. He gave me the Award of Excellence, the Medal of Excellence, which is the highest honor because of things I've done. And I will tell you, and it was a great honor for me. But we had a long discussion about this, and in his opinion, hydro, they are almost 100% hydro. They are efficient and self-sufficient, and it's something I really believe that the committee should look at. And you don't ruin the environment, and it's a great form of energy. Okay? Thank you. Thank you.
Well, yeah, certainly take on board your comments with regard to hydro, but I don't think Scotland needs any lessons on hydro. In fact, we were certainly ahead of the game.
You need more hydro.
Well,
you need more hydro. You don't need lessons on it, you're right, but you need more hydro.
We need a mix, yes. Absolutely.
No, you don't need a mix. You need more hydro.
So, you may be aware, and John Park, my colleague, has also mentioned the significant investment by Gamesa and Bifab, to name just two manufacturers. Indeed, Bifab have made a significant investment in the Arnish fabrication yard on your beloved Isle of Lewis.
Point of order. I think Gamesa haven't made. They've declared an intention.
Okay, well,
it's not quite the same thing.
Well, it's perhaps not here yet.
The Korean company was going to invest also. They pulled out.
Yeah, well, I'm trying to concentrate on your beloved island of Lewis, given your mother hails from that island. Bifab have announced a significant investment in the Arnish fabrication yard there, bringing jobs to an island desperately in need of work. And perhaps at this point I should declare that I hail from the Isle of Lewis. I come from the other side of Stornoway, from your people, about 5 miles, 5 miles from the village of that your mother was born in. So at least we have one thing in common. So I was curious to see your comments made this week since you arrived in Scotland, where you've continually rubbished polls which show the majority of Scots are in favour of wind farms. However, a recent poll by YouGov showed that almost 3/4 of Scots support wind power as part of our energy mix. And we've just been handed a poll this morning that shows that 93% of Scots polled are either more supportive or their views are unchanged by your comments on wind power. The poll also suggests 85% of Scots surveyed believe the Scottish Government should place little or no weight on your views when making decisions about energy policy. I'd be interested to hear what your view on that poll is.
I can tell you, it's all the way the poll is worded. I mean, I saw a poll today that said 53% of the people wanted it, but it was worded, would you like to have efficient, wonderful windmills built? The answer is yes. Depends on how the poll is worded. I could take a poll. Nobody knows more about polls than me. I can take a poll, and I can ask, in fact, if you want a poll, I had 93% approval for my project when people were fighting me. I had a 93% approval poll. So I understand polls. The one poll that I saw is, would you agree that very efficient windmills, should be built? Now, a lot of those polls don't use the wind energy. They use the word renewables. They use the word renewable. And renewables is a very nice word. But I will tell you that if you did a straight-up poll to people that have experienced the disaster of these industrial turbines being near their houses and in their community, you would have a tremendous negative result. Tremendous. They're talking about a poll they put, and I've read the polls. I've seen the wording. I almost voted in favor of them. But the fact is, if you would do a straight-up poll, what's called a straight-up poll, and you would only ask the people that have been affected by the industrial turbines, you would have a vast, vast majority of people rejecting them. But Scotland should reject them for another reason. You can't afford it.
So,
well, just a comment, we don't do government by polls. Yes, you do that. You do that. And actually, if you look at the polls that we've seen, the Moffat report and the thing by Visit Scotland and one or two other things, it's not the support that you should be looking at, it's the negatives. And there are huge numbers of percentages, say upwards of 20-25%, who do not support the idea, or they support the idea that a wind farm would ruin the landscape, and a wind farm would have an adverse effect on tourism, and they wouldn't like to see a wind turbine out of their bedroom window. And these are all statements that have been made in the polls that I've read over the years. So the important figure is the negative figure, those that don't agree with what the poll's trying to bring out, which is broad support for renewable energy. If you take 20% of people out of the people who visit Scotland who decide because they don't like turbines and they wreck the landscape, they're not quite coming back again, that's the most important figure, not the 80 that say they think it's okay.
I think most people are very well intentioned and they would love to support them if they believed in them. I think there's a very dangerous time now because people are coming to realise that they've been conned.
Speaking about polls, I don't know if you've seen today's Press and Journal. Today, a poll just done, 62% of those surveyed think that Scotland needs to take a look at their policies for the approval of these turbines, with over another 10% saying that they're not sure about turbines. That's a very powerful statistic. And also just on the Lewis thing, because I couldn't resist it, my mother's from Bragger, and I spent many summer holidays up there, so I love Scotland.
Yes. Final question, please.
Yeah, just one point. Obviously, both Mr. Trump or the Trump Organisation and CATS are choosing to ignore the polls that came out earlier in the week, and it's clearly a case of my mind's made. It's clearly a case.
Speak through the chair, please, not interrupt the question.
Clearly a case of my mind's made up. Don't confuse me with the facts. Now, we had the biggest poll of all last year, and as you know, the SNP campaigned strongly during last year's election campaign on a policy of delivering the equivalent of 100% renewables. So surely you can agree that the overwhelming vote for the current government is a vindication of the public support for the renewable energy policy, and it is you who is out of touch with public opinion.
Excuse me, that's because the public wasn't given the facts by you or by Alex Salmond. And if Alex Salmond were smart, he'd stop this right now, because what's happening to Scotland is going to be terrible. This is the same thinking that gave you Al Megrahi, where they let him out of prison in order to, it's true. This is the same exact thinking that gave you...
Mr. Trump, I think, please...
Because he'd be dead within 2 weeks. Well, guess what? He was seen running in the park last week.
This is a broad enough topic already
without
bringing up Mr. Megrahi, Mr. Trump. Thank you. I'll let Mr. Lang give a brief response to that question on polls.
Yes, well, Mr. MacDonald mentioned the resounding result of the Scottish National Party at the last election, which was based on a turnout of about 52% and 23 or 24% of the vote. So I don't think that gives the SNP a mandate to trash Scotland.
Thank you. Right. I'll move on. Claire Baker.
Thank you, Convener. And as this is my first committee, I'd just like to confirm that I have no registrable interest to declare. There have been a number of claims this morning over subsidy levels. Do the witnesses accept that all our energy resources receive levels of subsidy, and that the subsidy that goes to renewables is lower than the subsidy that goes to coal or gas or oil, and that is just part of how we deliver our energy system?
Looking at me.
I think you could forward.
We're not really discussing the subsidies of other things. That you'll have to look at it yourself. We're just saying that wind turbines do not work without massive government subsidy, meaning higher taxes. And I think when you really look at it, you're going to find that without these subsidies, they don't work. And when you end these subsidies, which I think will end soon, you're going to have wind farms all over Scotland and all over everywhere that are going to be abandoned, and it's not a pretty picture.
The race to build wind farms has got nothing to do with the environment, with CO2, with jobs. It's all to do with the subsidies which can be gained from the process. I think, if it's possible, Mr. Chairman, because at least half of this panel is about communities, could we go back a little bit to the effect on communities?
Well, I'd rather stick with the line of questioning, but we have time later. We'll come back to that if we can.
Just briefly, Convener, the claims this morning have been that renewables, and particularly wind, could not survive without subsidies. Do you accept that other energy sources, which are more traditional fossil fuel sources, receive greater levels of subsidy? than what renewables does.
No, they don't.
That's
They don't need
factually correct.
subsidies.
They
don't need subsidies.
No, they do. In 2010, 3.63 billion was spent in subsidy to coal, oil and gas, while 1.4 billion was spent on renewables. So there is a greater balance. What we're actually trying to do is shift.
You cannot compare that at all.
Because can we please speak through the chair, please? Hold on a second. Claire Baker, you finish your question.
What we are trying to do is shift the focus away from fossil fuel, expendable sources of energy towards cleaner, renewable energy to try and meet our energy targets into the long-term future for Scotland. And that's really what the committee are trying to look at.
Okay, Mr Gibson.
About 3.7 billion, I think, going to gas or coal or whatever, and 1.4 billion going to wind. But that 3.7 billion is producing 98% of our energy. The 1.4 billion is contributing a minute amount. So in terms of value for money, wind subsidy is grotesquely expensive.
The earlier question.
So it's not the headline amounts, it's the amount per unit of energy generated.
But do you accept the earlier questions have highlighted that we cannot continue with the energy sources we have at the moment into Scotland's future, and we need to look to other sources of energy, and the investment in renewables is about trying to take us to that place.
I'm all for that.
But he's not had a chance.
They have to work. Okay, it's very simple. You're spending £250,000 of subsidies to generate £150,000 of energy. Who's paying for that $100,000? Your taxpayers. How long are they going to put up with that? Okay, the renewables are fine. They have to work, though. Wind does not work.
And there's one other thing. You mentioned the expendable, meaning coal and things. You know, you expend and you'll use them up. I've never seen this written about. I've never seen it discussed. If you built a windmill and it lasted 1,000 years and you didn't have to spend lots of money on it, that's one thing. But these things are being decimated by the environment. The salt water, the wind, the rain, all of the problems. In fact, today there's a big story that the foundations and the footings in the windmills in the ocean are not holding up. I'm sure the insurance companies are going to be happy to hear this. But you have to rebuild these plants every 4 or 5 years. Who's going to do that? You're going to have to put up new windmills every 4 or 5 years or 10 years. They don't last. They're machines. They don't last. So when you say we're spending billions of dollars, you know how many windmills I'm hearing they want to put in Scotland? 9,000. 9,000 and more. That's a low number. So who's going to, in 5 years, when Alex Salmon's gone and when other people are gone and maybe you're gone, who's going to rebuild these things and put brand new ones up when these are decimated by conditions? Because they're machines. They have to be replaced. So, okay, now we're talking about this massive amount of money. But what happens in 5 years when you have to put a new one up? Who's going to pay for it?
But all energy,
I never heard that.
All energy sectors face exactly the same challenges.
Thank you. I think we'll move on. John Wilson.
Thank you, Convener. Can I welcome the panel this morning and follow on from Claire Baker's line of questioning? One of the figures that Claire Baker didn't mention was the £2.9 billion in decommissioning costs for nuclear power stations that's currently being expended by the UK government. This inquiry that's being held by the committee is to look at the wider renewables obligations that the Scottish Government has set itself in terms of targets. This is not just Scottish Government that's looking at renewables. This is part of the UK agenda as well, and it's part of the European agenda as well as a worldwide agenda to look at alternatives to fossil fuels and to actually provide energy, sustainable energy in the future. Mr Trump has made reference on several occasions to industrial turbines. Could the members from CATS, particularly Mr Lang, with his experience, as he mentioned in his opening remarks, in terms of his links with community turbine groups, forums that he mentioned that he's involved in, I think it was 3 local community groups you were involved in, who were getting benefits from turbines being sited close to or near local communities. And what would be the reaction of those communities if the turbines were turned off and the benefits, real community benefits that these communities were currently receiving were no longer there.
Yes, I think that in my statement I was quite quick in what I said. I said I was a member of 2 community benefit forums, and these are the forums that are set up by developers during or before the planning process to discuss with members of the community how community benefit could be managed if the communities were to be offered such a benefit. And so I went along the first time as a kind of curiosity because I had objected to the wind farm that I was now attending the Community Benefit Forum. However, whether you were for it or against it didn't get away from the fact that if this application was successful, there would be a community benefit, and that was something for which a mechanism had to be placed. And there's varieties of offers on the market, and some people see that this as being a helpful thing, others see it as being very, very divisive. So it sort of splits the community a bit. But my part was really just as a businessman to see that if the consent was made, the community benefits, whatever they were, would be involved in, would trickle down to the community. It's quite interesting. Highland Council's recently become involved in community benefit, and they've gone out on a limb without consultation with communities or the industry and introduced a community benefit policy and community benefit concordat. They will negotiate with the developers and deal with the applications for funding, and where benefits are above a certain threshold, they'll retain a portion of the funds. They say that the concordat has been agreed entirely without prejudice to the execution and implementation of the Council's powers, duties and obligations as a local planning authority. In Cat's opinion, there will be a substantial conflict of interest between determining wind farm developments and dealing with community benefit. I would expect I see that, yeah. I would expect Mr. Norman, in fact, who gave you evidence earlier, head of planning, and I note from his letter, or from the letter that Scottish Renewables have done to Highland Council, that they're very critical of their model. Scottish Renewables say quite correctly that community benefit contributions are not a material planning consideration and therefore should not be discussed until after planning consent is achieved, in the interest of complete impartiality and fairness. Scottish Renewables would argue strongly that any community benefit payments are kept entirely separate from the planning process. However, the advice from Scottish Renewables is ignored by their members, who start peddling beads for the natives a year or so before an application is made and maybe 2 years before a decision is taken. This, of course, means that those keen for the benefit with a wish list of projects to get on with could wait at a bare minimum 4 years to see some of the benefit. And, of course, if the application is refused, they see nothing.
Can I just come up with one point on that, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Convener? Community funds are a ridiculous diversion. It's actually the community's money in the first place. For every £100 of subsidy, which every household in the country pays towards renewable subsidies, for every £100, less than £1 comes back in the form of a community fund, and we're expected to be grateful or to think it's wonderful. One thing I'd like to move on to, though, is to be a bit more positive. The procedure so far has been a little adversarial. It shouldn't be. We should all be working for the best of Scotland, for the best of the environment, and for the best of everybody who lives here. So I think we should be combining, we should be sharing information to guide us forwards, not attacking each other. And there are two things, I think. One is that the rationale behind the targets isn't clear. What we need is a whole system study of the entire renewable process and the reasons for it, so that if it turns out that the reasons are good reasons, supported by evidence, you'll then be able to carry the country with you. and communities behind you.
Say that this is part of the reason for this inquiry, is to look at those targets and to find out whether or not the appropriate targets have been set,
but we don't have,
whether or not we are looking at the technologies that can actually deliver on those targets.
But we don't have the expertise between ourselves, with all due respect, to conduct that whole system survey. It needs to be independently approached, and we should welcome an independent study, all of us. We're after the truth, not against any particular advantage. Can I just finish? So I think, for everybody's sake, and certainly for the country's sake, we need a proper independent study. It needn't take long, but it's got to produce evidence on every aspect. And at the same time, we need an urgent review of the planning process. We're from communities who are concerned about turbines. The reason is that communities read every day about the doubts from different professional organisations about any justification for the policies. If you don't carry people with you, it's dangerous for democracy. People feel powerless, they feel trampled upon. I would just like to finish with one thing, and then you will hear no more from me. And I feel really strongly about the views of communities and the whole legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done, but can't do it all. We're simple people, powerless people, have strong beliefs, they have great intentions. If you once forfeit, going back to a quote from one of Mr. Trump's countrymen, but a great wise man, if you once forfeit the confidence of your fellow citizens, if you have a policy which is not based on something which is true, you can never regain their respect and esteem. And he went on to say, it's true that you may fool all the people some of the time. You can even fool some of the people all of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. And that's the dangerous position we're in.
Mr. Gibson, I'll refer you to the opinion poll that we've received today. It's been circulated.
As the First Minister,
please don't interrupt the question.
Mr. Gibson, the opinion poll says today, and Mr. Lang made reference to 20 to 25% of the population are concerned about wind turbines. 75 to 80% are in favour of wind turbines, and Mr. MacDonald read out the figures earlier to say that Mr. Trump's intervention in this debate has actually hardened some of the views of the communities out there in favour of wind turbines. The issue, Mr. Gibson, and you made a reference there, could you tell me, is the name of your organisation Communities Against Turbines or Communities Concerned About Turbines? Because you actually said you were concerned about turbines. The organisation, in my understanding, the raison d'etre of the Communities Against Turbines, is to be against turbines. And what are you against? Are you against large-scale wind farms, or are you against small-scale farmers and bringing in wind turbines in their areas to actually supplement their incomes? Because a number of the 8,000 to 10,000 wind turbines that Mr. Trump has made reference to, a large number of them are small-scale, one-off, two-off turbines that are being installed around the country by communities, by farmers and other companies who want to set up and generate their own renewable energy for their own use and for supply onto the grid.
I think you'll know very well that you can get whatever result you want from an opinion poll. It depends, and I'm sure
an election gave us a result last year.
Excuse me.
Elections can change when you have 10,000 turbines all over the country.
Please talk through the chair, Mr. Soriot.
As I think the First Minister would agree, the detail of the question is the key to getting the right response. We've had that over the referendum, just over a couple of words, let alone this. And it was only a week ago, if you want to talk about opinion polls, that Mori carried out a poll for Renewables UK, which showed that 80% of people thought that wind turbines in the landscape were less than acceptable, and 16% of which thought they were completely unacceptable. You can get whatever results you want. What is important is not polls, it's not scoring points, it's establishing beyond doubt what we're trying to achieve and what the evidence is. We don't have that at the moment. If we had the right evidence, the whole of this room should agree. but without it, you're imposing a policy on communities which are too vulnerable to be able to protect themselves.
Mr Gibson, you never answered my main question.
Ask it again.
Are you concerned about turbines, or are you against turbines? And what turbine developments are you against as an organisation? Because I gave you two examples, the industrial wind farms and the small-scale turbines being established by communities, farmers and others. What are you? Is it a blanket against turbines, or are you in favour of some turbines but not others?
I'm totally unconvinced about what they can achieve, and so I think if you have turbines anywhere, it must be very clear that they're not damaging other equally important interests in the country. And
Mr. Lang, briefly, do you want to add to that?
I just wanted to draw the member's attention to the First Minister's own constituency up in Bachen, which is almost ground to a standstill because of the number of applications, mostly, I would say, from small farmers, but for big turbines. And the same thing could apply in Mr. Brodie's patch down in Galloway and South Ayrshire, absolutely inundated with applications for them. Obviously, the money is very attractive, the amount of funding they can get from a feed-in tariff. So it's really a wholesale proliferation of turbines of all scales. The thing is out of order. It's just a runaway train, and policy is not working.
Okay, thank you. Now, we are already over time. I have 4 members who have allocations of time left and who want to ask questions. What I intend to do is take all 4 questions together, and then if the panel could answer them collectively, that would be very helpful. I'm going to start with Stuart McMillan.
Thank you. Sure. Earlier on in this inquiry, this committee received evidence from John Robertson, the Managing Director of Burnt Island Fabrication, where he said, "We have a tremendous opportunity to create an industry. There is good technology and expertise out there and companies that can deliver." Now, already Scotland employs some 11,000 people within the renewables sector, and forecasts some £30 billion worth of future investment. In terms of the 2 organisations, why it appears that you actually want to stymie any potential opportunity for job opportunities for individuals across Scotland, and I find that quite staggering to understand.
Okay, thank you. We'll just leave that hanging in the air if we can, and we'll take Patrick Harvey's question next.
Thank you, Convener. Very little has been said about climate change today. This is a question that I want to direct principally at Communities Against Turbines, because we know very clearly Mr Trump's view. He's written recently, global warming has been proven to be a canard. So we understand his view. He disagrees with every single member of this Parliament in voting for a radical action programme on reducing emissions. Is that the same position as Communities Against Turbines? Some of the written evidence and some of the website material seems to suggest that you support the idea that decarbonisation should be a policy objective in energy. But Mr Gibson has written, "There is increasing evidence that global warming is not actually happening. It seems likely that governments have been duped by the wind and global warming industries." This was written in a submission on the Climate Change Act. Can I ask Mr Gibson, does he stand by those words, and does Communities Against Turbines agree with Mr Trump in denying all mainstream science on climate change, and if so, what is his scientific qualification for doing so?
Okay, thank you. Just leave that one hanging in the air. Mike McKenzie.
Thank you, Convener. I'm beginning to get the idea that the panel don't like wind energy, but Mr Trump may not know that prior to being elected, I was a builder and developer for many years on a much smaller scale than you. However, and I'm going to be absolutely straight with you, I've spoken to dozens of people over the last few weeks since you got involved publicly in this debate. One thing you may not know about the Scottish people, whilst we love to do business with you, we welcome your investment, we do not like being told what to do. We don't feel that gives you a licence. And I'm concerned that perhaps your efforts, public efforts, are very counterproductive. And what I would suggest, you've mentioned already that your mother comes from the island of Lewis. I'm sure you're as shocked as I am to know that fuel poverty on the island of Lewis is running at 50%. Part of the government's energy policy is to reduce fuel consumption, energy consumption, by 12%. And one way we can do that is to insulate homes. Now, I've heard it reported in the press that you intend to donate £10 million to the campaign against wind. I would suggest to you that it would be a much more effective intervention, if you care to make it, and if you do, would be to donate all or some of that money to tackling fuel poverty, perhaps on the island of Lewis, and I would be very happy to work with you on that point.
Okay, thank you. And the very last, final, brief question, please, from Graham Pearson.
Take the lead in terms of being brief. First, a couple of declarations. I, to my knowledge, have no family on the Isle of Lewis. I feel I'm probably the only person in Scotland in that position. Secondly, I should admit for my sins that I chaired the inaugural meeting of the Communities Against Turbines last year. As the member for the South of Scotland on list, I was aware of the pressure in the communities there in relation to this issue. And the question is for Mr Lang, Mr Gibson, one or either. Could you give us some insight over these past 4 or 5 years of developing and articulating the position? Do they feel that the government has in place the mechanisms to hear the issues that they raise and to deal with the facts that cause them concern? And can they also reflect for us the range of communities they represent, the membership?
Thank you very much. Right. There's quite a lot there to try and address. I suggest we just work our way along the panel, maybe start with you, Mr Lang. We can pick up the points that are relevant.
I think,
briefly, please.
I think I will be as quick as I can. I think Mr Harvey mentioned climate change, and I've read a tremendous amount about it on both sides. I've been to see films, Mr Gore's film, many other publications, and I'm completely puzzled. I really don't know whether climate change is happening or not. James Lovelock, who has just made who wrote the Gaia theory, has just said that he doesn't think it's that bad. So I think that the jury's out on that. I think somebody asked me or asked why we don't like wind turbines, and I would like to just tell you a little bit of one of the reasons is about noise, and this is a subject that should be at the forefront of every member's mind when they consider the effect that these turbines have on people. And I quote from the British Medical Journal of 12th March and acknowledge the authors Chris Hanning and Professor Alan Evans. And we have submitted 4 testimonies from people who are the victims of noise nuisance from wind farms. Shortly before wind farms began to be erected close to housing, complaints emerged of adverse effects on health. Sleep disturbance was the main complaint. Such reports were dismissed as being subjective and anecdotal, but experts contend that the quality, consistency and ubiquity of the complaints constitute epidemiological evidence of a strong link between wind turbine noise, ill health and disruption of sleep. The noise emitted by a typical onshore 2.5 megawatt wind turbine has 2 main components, and I won't repeat that. It's the noise from the mechanical noise and the aerodynamic noise as the blades pass through the air. And this provides an impulsive noise which is various...
This is very interesting, but you'll appreciate we are very short of time, and I would really ask you please to address the questions that the panel asked, the members asked.
Well, one of my comments was going to be that the guidance that is used in assessing these turbines is completely out of date, and I hope you take that on board. What was the next question?
I think you've dealt with the question on climate change. I think there was a question about economic development, whether you felt that opposition to renewables was stymieing economic development.
That is something I know something about, having been a minor industrialist. And I know when in Glasgow, when I had my business there, and Babcock and Wilcox got a job for a new power station, we lost all our employees practically overnight because they were paying better rates. And the same thing could happen with the offshore. The impact on local business will be quite bad when people like Biofab, who is a wonderful company, have been round their works, do what I used to do. And The problem is, where does the labour come from? Is it trained? How is it going to be trained? The offshore industry will produce a lot of jobs, I've no doubt, but I don't think there's enough planning for how these jobs, where they're going to come, where the people are going to come from. Are they going to live in labour camps like they did when they were building the oil production platforms and so on? It's just, there's no houses for these 11, 20, 30, 40,000 people.
Okay, thank you. Mr Gibson.
Thank you. I'll be as brief as I can. I think the first point from Stuart McMillan was on jobs, and on that we must be clear when we're addressing this policy. Are we talking about job creation? Are we talking about climate change? Are we talking about energy security? It changes all the time. Of course, don't please interrupt. Of course we're in favour of job creation. Of course we want the very best for Scotland. But we must be clear. We must carry out a whole system survey to agree what we're aiming for and to know the science. You asked what my approach was. My degree is a science degree. I approach things wanting to find out the truth. We should all be doing that. A lot of the evidence that comes out, particularly in recent months, from professional bodies, from engineers, does not support the present policy. We mustn't blind ourselves. We must listen to everybody. We must find the truth, or try to. You talked about Mr. Trump's involvement. He cares very much about this country. I think if you look at, from a money point of view, number one, I would say we're completely independent. We've received no funds whatsoever, other than what we've raised locally. If you look at the wind industry, 90% of it is foreign-owned. They pay tens and tens of millions of pounds on lobbying and PR. So put things in proportion.
Climate change issue, Mr Gibson, please.
We don't know. We don't know. There's no clear. All that we do know is there's a lot of covering up, a lot of unprofessional behaviour. Why do that if you're sure of your ground?
The global warming is
please not interrupt the witnesses, please. We're over time. Carry on, Mr Gibson.
In general, let's work together. We shouldn't be on two sides. We want the best for the country, we want the best for the environment, we want the best for Scotland's people. Let's do a proper whole system survey. It could be done in 6 months. Find the truth.
Well, first of all, I believe that climate change is not man-made, and I have the view that many people do. If you look at global cooling and global warming, in the 1920s they had many, many magazine covers on the big problem of the day, and that was called global cooling. Now we have global warming. I just don't believe it is man-made, and I think you're spending billions and billions of pounds unnecessarily and going to affect the future of Scotland. As far as jobs are concerned, jobs are created for your industrial turbines. I don't use the word renewables because I feel strongly that certain renewables are very good, as I told you. But on the industrial turbines, jobs are being created in other countries, and very few jobs are being created here. But any jobs that are being created here are more than offset by what you're going to lose in your most important industry, which is tourism. You're going to lose tremendous numbers of jobs in tourism. And I feel very strongly about that. So the few jobs that you will create will be offset to a much larger extent by the jobs you're going to lose in tourism. Now, one thing that happened interestingly last week, we didn't really want to get into it too much, but this is an appropriate time. We were approved for a beautiful little staging area up front on the road, and we were for a security house. Beautiful, elegant, we got nice compliments. Everything was approved except for one thing: flagpoles, which are 1/10 the size of the windmills. And the reason the flagpoles weren't approved was it said, quote, I'm quoting, unacceptable impact on the visual amenity of the area. And they're 1/10 the size of these massive, ugly wind turbines. Now, with that all being said, we have a tremendous investment in this development. I would love to proceed with this development. I can't proceed if the hotel is going to be looking into industrial turbines, and nobody here would if you were in my position. But if the Vattenfall job is terminated, I will immediately proceed with the hotel, and I'm looking forward to doing it. And I have to tell you, my project is a much bigger project. You know, we're talking about £750 million when it's finished. My project is a much bigger project than Vattenfall, which I heard was £60 million. Then I see 200. I see all different numbers. I don't think they know what it is, if they even want to build it. But I see 60 and I see 200. But my project is 750 potentially million pounds. I will start on the hotel immediately if I hear that that horrendously located wind farm will not be built.
Mr. Trump, Mr. Stoddart, do you want to add something?
Just because you were democratically elected doesn't mean you have a right to unilaterally and just carte blanche impose all your policies on your people. People all over Scotland are screaming in opposition to these wind powers. So you can't use the excuse that we've been elected and we have a right to go forward.
Thank you, Mr. Sorio. Can I say we have, because of time, to draw matters to a close there? There's no points of order in this committee. Well, point of order, Mr. Harvey.
Standing orders do allow points of order. In a previous session in this inquiry, Convener, you'd indicated that the similar questions to those you put to the environment organisations about their funding could be put to others. I appreciate that we're tight for time and that there's no time left to explore that, but we do have an organisation in front of us which has said in national press that they intend to use a large foreign donation to influence the outcome of local elections. I wanted the opportunity to explore the ethics of that. If we don't have the opportunity to do that now, can I ask that we write to Communities Against Turbines and explore that issue and allow them the opportunity to answer some very serious questions on that matter?
I think that's a fair point, and I'm happy to do so. Can I, at that point, say thank you to our witnesses for coming along. Thank you to Communities Against Turbines. Thank you for the Trump organisation. I was tempted to ask you, Mr. Trump, given your love for Scotland and your interest in pursuing investments in Scotland, whether you had thought about putting in an offer to buy Rangers Football Club. But I'm afraid we didn't have an opportunity this morning to progress that particular point.
Be thinking about it.
Well, that's very. That will make tomorrow's front pages, I dare say. Thank you very much to our witnesses. Thank you to members of the committee and additional MSPs. Can I apologise to all who I know had additional questions to ask, and we did not have time to get round to that. And at that point, can I close this meeting of the committee? I ask the